Some stories begin with light. This one begins with shadows. Before you scroll, ask yourself this: what happens when the smallest voice in the darkest room pleads for mercy, and no one is there to listen? What if that voice belonged to a child, a little girl who had already seen more pain than most adults ever would? This is the story of Amara. And it begins in the forgotten corners of Ravenbrook City. The night was restless. The wind clawed at the cracked window panes, howling through the broken frames like a wounded animal. Inside a cramped apartment on the city's edge, the air felt heavy, suffocating, as though the walls themselves had grown weary of the misery they contained. On a thin mattress pushed against the far wall, sat a little girl no older than 7. Her knees were pulled up to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around a worn-out teddy bear whose button eye had long since fallen off. Its fur was ragged, it seemed stretched from too many nights of being clutched in fear. But to Amara, it was more than a toy, it was her shield, the only piece of comfort she had left. The sound of muffled voices drifted in from the next room. At first, they were just words, sharp, clipped, bitter. But slowly, they grew louder. The argument broke into the silence like glass shattering against the floor. Her stepmother, Lydia, was in one of her moods again. "You think you're so clever, hiding things from me?" Lydia's voice sliced through the thin walls. "Nothing in this house belongs to you, do you hear me? Nothing." Amara buried her face into the teddy's neck. She had heard it all before, the screaming, the accusations, the endless storm of anger that never seemed to tire. Her small body trembled with each raised word, each bitter laugh. She knew what came after the shouting. Her heart pounded in her chest. She whispered to the teddy, as if it could protect her, "It'll be over soon. Just stay quiet. Stay quiet." But the voices only grew louder. The slam of a door jolted her. Footsteps thundered down the hallway, each one echoing closer, heavier. The air seemed to freeze, and Amara's breath caught in her throat. The bedroom door burst open. Light from the hallway spilled across the floor, stretching like a blade. In the doorway stood Lydia, tall, furious, her eyes gleaming with something colder than anger. Amara shrank back against the wall, clutching the teddy so tightly it seemed threatened to tear. She wanted to disappear into the shadows, to become invisible. But Lydia's gaze locked onto her like a predator who had already chosen its prey. "Why are you sitting there like a useless doll?" Lydia hissed, stepping into the room. "Do you think those pitiful eyes of yours will change anything?" Amara's lips trembled. Words formed but stuck in her throat, caught between fear and desperation. Then, finally, they broke free, fragile, pleading, almost too soft to hear. "Please, don't hurt us." The words hung in the air, trembling like a candle's flame about to die. For a moment, silence swallowed the room. The shouting from earlier vanished. Even the wind seemed to still. There was only the sound of Amara's tiny voice, echoing in the hollow space between her and the woman who should have been her protector. "Don't hurt us." Not just me, her plea implied. Us. She meant herself. The teddy bear. The memories of her mother that lived only in whispers and faded photographs. Everything she had left in the world, everything she clung to, was wrapped into those 3 desperate words. Lydia's face hardened. For her, those words were an annoyance, a weakness. But for Amara, they were a shield, the only shield she had left in a life that had given her nothing but battles too heavy for her small shoulders. Her wide eyes glistened with tears she refused to let fall. She was too used to swallowing them back, too used to hiding her cries in the folds of her pillow at night. But tonight, something felt different. Tonight, her voice had broken through the silence. And though no one had come yet, though the apartment walls did not open and swallow her pain, those words, "Please, don't hurt us," were not wasted. Because sometimes, the smallest whisper has the power to set destiny in motion. In that fragile moment, we glimpsed the truth, a child who has known too much pain for her age, a child standing on the edge of despair, and yet somehow, still holding on to hope. Shadows filled the corners of the room. The city outside carried on, unaware that in a little apartment on its edge, a plea had been made that would one day echo far beyond these crumbling walls. A plea that would not go unanswered forever. And as the night deepened, Amara clung tighter to her teddy, her whisper fading into the dark. Please, don't hurt us. Some homes are filled with warmth. This one was filled with silence. Not the kind of silence that brings peace, but the heavy, suffocating kind that presses on your chest and makes every breath feel borrowed. It was a silence that screamed louder than words. And in the middle of it sat a little girl named Amara. The kitchen of the Ravenbrook apartment was cold and unwelcoming, a place that should have smelled of bread and laughter but instead carried the sour sting of resentment. The wooden table was chipped and stained from years of neglect. A single plate sat before Amara, the food untouched, its steam long gone cold. She didn't move. She didn't dare. Across from her stood Lydia. Tall. Sharp. Every movement of hers seemed designed to wound. Her shadow loomed over the girl, stretching across the table like a claw. Eat, Lydia snapped, her voice slicing through the room. Do you think food grows on trees? Or do you think I work myself to the bone so you can just sit there staring at me like a fool? Amara's small hands trembled in her lap. Her eyes dropped to the floor. She didn't answer. She knew better. Silence. But silence was never safe with Lydia. You're mocking me, aren't you? Lydia's tone rose, her face twisting with disdain. That silence of yours, always pretending to be innocent, always looking at me with those pitiful eyes. Do you think people don't see through you? Amara's lips pressed together. She lowered her gaze further, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it would shake the chair beneath her. Every word felt like a stone thrown at glass, sharp and deliberate. The glass was her. Her stepmother's accusations were endless. Spilled milk. A broken plate. Even silence itself was enough to bring the storm crashing down. Amara had learned long ago that in this house, there was no such thing as safety. There was only survival. The wooden chair beneath her creaked as she shifted slightly, trying to make herself smaller, trying to disappear into the shadows of the kitchen. Her plate remained untouched. A piece of bread. A thin smear of butter. But to eat meant to move, and to move meant to invite more fury. So she stayed still, her hunger gnawing at her belly like a restless animal. Ungrateful, Lydia muttered, crossing her arms. Just like your mother. The word stabbed deeper than any slap could. Amara's breath hitched, but she did not cry. She had learned not to give Lydia the satisfaction of tears. She sat there, fragile and silent, as the air thickened with tension. Outside, through the cracked blinds of the kitchen window, Ravenbrook's skyline shimmered in the distance. Towers of glass and steel reached for the sky, glowing with wealth and luxury. The city was alive with laughter, music, and lights. But inside this apartment, in this small corner of the grand city, darkness ruled. For Amara, that glittering skyline felt like another world, one she could see but never touch. A world where children laughed freely, where families shared dinners without fear, where love was not rationed like crumbs. She dreamed of that world, even as the cold walls around her whispered that she would never belong to it. Her stepmother's voice broke through her thoughts again, sharper this time. Look at me when I speak to you. Amara flinched but kept her eyes down. Meeting Lydia's gaze was dangerous. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff, you never knew if the ground would hold or if it would crumble beneath you. Lydia leaned closer, her breath hot with venom. You're nothing without me. Nothing. Do you understand that? Amara's fingers tightened around the hem of her dress beneath the table. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. She wanted to scream, to say she wasn't nothing, that her mother's love had made her something, that deep inside she still carried a spark no cruelty could snuff out. But the words stayed trapped in her throat, locked away by fear. Instead, she prayed. Softly. Silently. Words only she could hear. Please, God. Please let someone hear me. Please let someone come. Her prayers had become her secret lifeline. Each night, she whispered them into the dark, clutching her teddy bear as though it could carry her words to the heavens. Sometimes, she imagined her mother was listening. Sometimes, she imagined angels pressed their ears close, storing her words in golden jars until the day they could be answered. But here, in the cruel silence of the kitchen, she prayed again, not for toys, not for sweets, not even for freedom. Just for someone to listen. Someone to care. Someone to silence the storm that never seemed to end. The clock on the wall ticked louder than her heartbeat, marking each second of her suffering. Lydia turned away finally, muttering under her breath, her rage simmering but not gone. The tension in the air lingered like smoke after a fire. Amara remained still, her plate untouched, her prayer unfinished. And in that moment, with the city's lights glowing in the distance and the darkness pressing close around her, she held on to the only thing no one could take from her, hope. Hope that somewhere beyond Ravenbrook's glittering skyline, beyond the cruelty of this apartment, there was a voice waiting to answer hers. Hope that one day, her silence would be broken, not by fear, but by love. The city of Ravenbrook never truly slept. Its streets pulsed with neon lights and murmurs of nightlife, but inside one cramped apartment, midnight stretched on in heavy silence. The only sound was the tick of a tired clock, marking the slow passage of hours. Amara tossed and turned on her thin mattress, clutching her threadbare teddy bear against her chest. Sleep was a fragile thing in this home, often broken by arguments, slammed doors, or the sharp edge of her stepmother's voice. Tonight was no different. A sound cut through her restless dreams, the creak of footsteps across the floorboards. Her small eyes blinked open. The room was cloaked in shadow, moonlight filtering weakly through the torn curtain. Every instinct told her to stay in bed, to stay hidden. But curiosity, no, fear, pulled her to her feet. She padded softly across the room, her bare feet brushing against the cold floor. The teddy bear dangled from one hand as she crept toward the thin crack of light seeping from the living room door. Voices. No, not voices. Just one voice. Lydia's. Amara froze, her heart thudding against her ribs. She leaned closer, pressing her ear to the gap. Lydia's tone was low, almost serpentine, curling through the silence. Yes, tomorrow. They're worthless just sitting here. I'll get more than enough for them. A pause. The rustle of papers. Yes, even the jewelry. What do I care if it belonged to her? That woman's been gone for years. Amara's breath caught in her throat. She knew exactly what Lydia meant. Her mother's things. The few treasures her late mother had left behind, kept in a wooden chest by Amara's bed. A pearl necklace, slightly cracked. A faded scarf, still carrying the faint scent of lavender. A diary, its pages filled with words she couldn't yet read but knew were precious. These weren't just objects. They were pieces of the woman whose memory still wrapped around her heart like a blanket in the cold. And Lydia was going to take them. Sell them. Strip away the last fragile thread connecting Amara to the mother she had lost. The little girl pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to stifle the sob clawing its way up her throat. Tears stung her eyes and spilled silently down her cheeks. Her knees buckled, and she slid to the floor, curling against the wall as if to disappear into its shadows. No. Please, no. Her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her teddy bear crushed between them. She whispered into the silence, her voice trembling and broken. Don't hurt us. Mama's things are all I have left. Her words dissolved into the darkness, unheard. No one came running. No one comforted her. The walls only echoed her plea back to her, mocking the desperation in her voice. For Amara, those belongings weren't about wealth. They weren't about beauty. They were about love, the only proof she had that her mother had once held her, sung to her, told her she was cherished. To lose them would be to lose her mother all over again. She pressed her forehead against her knees, sobbing softly. Each tear fell like a tiny bead onto the floor, glistening in the dim light. The night swallowed her cries, cruel and indifferent. In the living room, Lydia's laughter rang sharp and cold. She ended the call with a snap of her phone, humming as though she hadn't just broken the heart of a child sleeping in the next room. Amara's body shook with quiet sobs. But beneath her grief, a new feeling flickered, something small, fragile, but stubborn. A spark of resistance. Maybe she can take the necklace. Maybe she can take the scarf. But she will never take Mama from me. It was a vow whispered only in her heart, but it was enough to steady her trembling hands. She wiped her tears on the sleeve of her nightdress and hugged her teddy tighter. Yet, as much as she wanted to protect her mother's things, Amara was still just a child. Powerless. Alone. Her words had gone unheard, and in this house, they always would. Still, she whispered again, softer this time, almost like a prayer drifting into the night. Don't hurt us. The clock ticked. The shadows shifted. Lydia moved about, oblivious. And outside, far beyond the walls of Ravenbrook's dim apartment blocks, fate was already stirring. Because while no one heard Amara's cry that night, destiny had a way of listening. Threads were already weaving, lives already moving closer. And though she could not know it yet, her whispered words had not vanished. They had traveled further than she could imagine, carried by the unseen winds of fate, toward the one man who had the power to silence Lydia's cruelty forever. Her father. The millionaire she had never met. The night grew still again. Lydia retreated into her room, smug with her secret plans. Amara curled on the floor for a long time, hugging her teddy and clutching her mother's memory in her fragile arms. Alone, in the dark, she looked smaller than ever. Yet her tears glistened like stars, proof that even in the cruelest night, hope still lived. And though her words had gone unanswered in that moment, they would not remain unanswered for long. For destiny was already moving closer. Some nights carry a weight that words cannot explain. They arrive uninvited, draping the air in a heaviness that settles deep in the chest, making every breath feel different, as if the universe itself is trying to whisper something. For Jonathan Hale, that night was one of them. He sat alone in the vast study of his Ravenbrook mansion, a room built on polished oak and silent grandeur. The shelves brimmed with books bound in leather, the fireplace glowed faintly, and the city skyline shimmered through the tall windows. To an outsider, it looked like perfection, the home of a man who had conquered the world. But inside Jonathan's chest, there was no peace. His eyes drifted to a photograph on his desk. The edges were worn, the glass slightly cracked, but the image within was clear. A woman with gentle eyes and a smile like morning light. Beside her, a baby girl with wide, curious eyes, his daughter. Amara. The name lingered in his heart like a song he hadn't sung in years. He whispered it into the silence, the syllables tasting both sweet and bitter. Amara. It had been years since he'd last held her. Years since he had kissed her forehead or heard her laughter. Success had stolen time from him, and tragedy had stolen her mother. The grief had been too much, and somewhere in the madness of building his empire, he had lost touch with the one bond that should have mattered most. Wealth had filled his house, but it had emptied his soul. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. And that's when it came, a strange heaviness pressing against his heart. It wasn't pain. It wasn't fear. It was something else. A pull. A summons. As if someone, somewhere, was calling him. He rose slowly, almost against his own will, and walked to the window. Ravenbrook stretched before him, glittering with its endless lights. Yet beyond the glass towers and wide streets, he remembered another side of the city. The narrow alleys, the cracked pavements, the neighborhoods he had left behind. The places where life had been hard but real. The thought of returning there had never once crossed his mind. Not until now. Jonathan's fingers tightened around the window frame. He could not explain why, but he knew he could not stay still tonight. The weight in his chest demanded movement. He had learned long ago to trust his instincts in business, but this was something deeper. Something almost spiritual. With a sigh that carried years of longing, he picked up his coat. Down in the garage, his sleek black car hummed to life. The gates of the mansion opened slowly, like doors parting on a forgotten past. Jonathan gripped the wheel and guided the car onto the quiet streets of Ravenbrook. The city was different at night. Gone were the bustling crowds and ceaseless traffic. Instead, the streets stretched silent and haunting, as though Ravenbrook itself was sleeping and dreaming. Neon signs flickered weakly, shadows stretched across alleyways, and in the distance, the faint cry of sirens rose and fell. Jonathan's car glided through it all, the hum of the engine steady against the backdrop of the night. But inside him, nothing was steady. His chest tightened with every street he passed, his mind flickering with memories he had buried too long. He saw her face again, her smile, her warmth. The woman he had loved and lost. The woman who had once made his world bright. He had promised to protect their daughter, to keep her safe. Yet here he was, surrounded by fortune, while she was, where? He didn't even know. The shame was bitter. At a red light, Jonathan slowed. His reflection stared back at him in the windshield, sharp suit, silvering hair, tired eyes. To the world, he was Jonathan Hale, the untouchable millionaire. But in this moment, he saw only a father who had failed. The light turned green. His foot pressed the accelerator. And still, that heaviness pushed at him, guiding him, urging him deeper into the city he had abandoned. He passed through districts he hadn't seen in years, old buildings with cracked paint, street vendors packing up for the night, children playing under broken street lamps. Each sight pressed harder against his conscience, reminding him of the distance between his life of luxury and the life he had left behind. The wheel seemed to turn on its own as if fate itself was steering him. And then, without knowing why, Jonathan slowed near a block of weary apartment buildings. Their windows glowed faintly, curtains swaying in the night breeze. Something about this place made him stop. He sat there for a moment, the engine purring, his hands frozen on the wheel. His heart pounded, and he didn't know why. He only knew this, the weight that had followed him all evening now settled into stillness. As if he had arrived exactly where he was meant to be. Jonathan Hale exhaled slowly, unaware that just a few floors above, a little girl sat curled on the floor, clutching her teddy bear, whispering words into the darkness. Words he could not yet hear, but words that had already found their way to him. Don't hurt us. Fate had begun to close the distance. That night, the city of Ravenbrook held its breath. One man searching for redemption was unknowingly drawing closer to the child whose cries had traveled beyond walls, beyond shadows, and into the heart of destiny. And though Jonathan did not yet know it, his life, and Amara's, was about to change forever. Some moments in life stretch longer than time itself. They hang in the air, heavy and electric, as if the world is holding its breath, waiting to see what will happen next. For Amara, dawn had always been the cruelest hour. The darkness of night gave her a strange comfort, it hid her tears, muffled her cries, and allowed her to fold into silence. But dawn meant voices. It meant Lydia's footsteps echoing across the apartment floorboards, the slam of cupboard doors, the clatter of dishes thrown into the sink. And, inevitably, it meant anger. This morning was no different. The sun had only just begun to bleed faint streaks of gray across the sky when Lydia stormed into the small kitchen, her face twisted with frustration. The air smelled of stale coffee and burned toast, a bitterness that seemed to match her mood. Amara sat at the table, her teddy bear resting on her lap like a fragile shield. She dared not move, dared not breathe too loudly. But Lydia's rage needed no reason. It hunted for excuses, clawed for weaknesses. "You useless child," Lydia hissed, her eyes narrowing on the untouched plate before Amara. "Food wasted again. Do you think this house runs on your silence? Speak. Why don't you ever speak?" Amara lowered her gaze. Her small hands trembled as she tried to whisper, but the words caught in her throat. That was enough to set Lydia off. With a sharp motion, she slammed her hand against the table, rattling the plate and sending a spoon clattering to the floor. Amara flinched, her breath quickening. And then, Lydia's hand rose, high, trembling with fury, ready to strike. Time seemed to slow. Amara's heart pounded against her chest like a frantic drum. She pressed her teddy closer, her lips trembling as the words spilled out, louder than ever before, words that carried every ounce of fear and desperation inside her tiny frame. "Don't hurt us." The cry split the silence, sharp and raw. It wasn't just a plea. It was a scream of survival, a call into the universe itself. And in that instant, the universe answered. The front door burst open. The sound was thunderous, shaking the thin walls of the apartment. The hinges groaned as the door slammed against the wall, and for a heartbeat, Lydia froze, her raised hand suspended midair. Then came the voice. Deep. Commanding. Like the roll of a storm across a restless sea. Enough. Not another word. Not another strike. The words didn't just enter the room, they filled it, flooding every corner, every shadow, until even the silence seemed to retreat in awe. Amara's eyes widened. Her teddy slipped from her hands as she turned toward the doorway. There he stood. Jonathan Hale. Tall, his presence larger than the room itself, framed by the faint morning light spilling in behind him. His eyes, fierce and unyielding, were locked on Lydia, but his voice carried the weight of something greater than anger. It carried protection. Lydia staggered back, her face paling. She tried to speak, to mask her fury with false indignation, but no words came. The force in Jonathan's tone had stripped her of power. For the first time in her life, Amara saw her stepmother silent. And for the first time in her life, she saw someone standing between her and the pain. Her small chest rose and fell in quick bursts, her breath trembling as she tried to make sense of the figure in the doorway. She had seen his face before, in faded photographs, in hazy dreams, but now here he was, real and unshakable. Her father. Jonathan's gaze softened the moment it shifted from Lydia to Amara. In that instant, the thunder in his voice quieted, replaced by something fragile. Something human. His daughter's eyes met his, wide with confusion and fear. He saw the tears shimmering there, saw the exhaustion in her young face, and something inside him broke. No wealth, no empire, no polished success could erase the truth of what he saw now. His child, cornered by cruelty, whispering for mercy. The silence that followed was heavy, but not the same as before. This silence wasn't filled with fear. It was filled with change. With a promise. Jonathan stepped further into the room, his footsteps steady, unhurried, yet carrying the weight of decision. His presence seemed to expand, making the small apartment feel even smaller. Lydia backed toward the counter, her hands trembling, her lips pressed tightly together. Amara remained frozen at the table, staring at him as though afraid he might disappear if she blinked. Not again, Jonathan said firmly, his eyes still on Lydia. Not ever again. The words carried finality. They weren't a warning, they were a vow. Amara's heart pounded, but for the first time, it wasn't only from fear. There was something else, something unfamiliar rising in her chest. Hope. Her little fingers reached slowly for the teddy bear that had slipped to the floor. She held it close, but this time, it wasn't her only shield. There was someone else standing between her and the storm. Her father's shout had shaken the room. But more than that, it had broken the cycle. The walls that had always held echoes of cruelty now held the echo of something stronger, a voice that refused to be silent, a voice that refused to look away. For the first time, Amara allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. And in that fragile moment, the silence that followed was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of change. The room seemed smaller than ever, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. The faint light of dawn spilled through the thin curtains, brushing against the dust in the air, but no one moved. Lydia pressed herself against the counter, her face pale and tight with panic. The anger that had always fueled her words seemed to evaporate under Jonathan Hale's gaze. His presence filled the room like a storm cloud, dark, heavy, unrelenting. But Jonathan wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the little girl still sitting at the wooden table, clutching a worn teddy bear against her chest as if it were her only protection. And for a long, breathless moment, he simply stared. Something stirred inside him, something he couldn't name but couldn't ignore. A pull, deep and unshakable, that rooted him where he stood. The resemblance was undeniable. Those eyes, wide, cautious, yet shimmering with quiet strength, he had seen them before. Years ago. In another life. In another woman. Her mother. Jonathan's throat tightened, his chest rising and falling unevenly as the truth clawed its way closer to the surface. "Who is she?" he asked, his voice low, dangerous, but trembling with something more than anger. "Tell me the truth." Lydia's lips parted, her eyes darting wildly, searching for a lie she could weave into the silence. She's just a burden I've been left with," she muttered, her words sharp and desperate. "You don't understand." "Enough." The single word cracked like a whip, silencing her. Jonathan's eyes burned into hers, stripping away every excuse, every deception. Slowly, hesitantly, he turned back toward the child. Amara. The name seemed to settle into his mind as naturally as breathing, though he had not spoken it aloud. His legs felt unsteady as he took a step closer, then another, until he was kneeling beside her chair. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. Her small face carried the same delicate lines, the same softness he had once traced in moments of love long past. And those eyes, his God, those eyes were a mirror. Jonathan's hand trembled as he reached out, stopping just short of touching her. His voice, usually steady and commanding, wavered as he whispered words that seemed to tear straight from the core of his being. "You're mine, aren't you?" The room fell utterly still. Amara's lips parted, her breath catching. She didn't fully understand the weight of his words, but her heart knew. She had felt something the moment he stepped through the door, something safe, something unexplainable, something she had never felt before. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision as she clutched the teddy tighter. She didn't nod. She didn't speak. But in her frightened, hopeful gaze, he found the answer. Jonathan's chest ached as the truth crashed into him like a wave. This child, this fragile, trembling girl, crying out for mercy in a world that had shown her none, she was his. His daughter. The storm he had carried for years, the regret, the longing, the unanswered questions, finally broke, pouring through him with the force of revelation. He saw it all at once, the love he had lost, the years he had missed, the life stolen from both of them. Lydia's voice cut through the silence, sharp and defensive. "She doesn't need you. Where were you all these years? You abandoned her, her mother." But Jonathan turned, his glare silencing her instantly. His voice, though low, carried an authority that left no space for argument. "Not another word," he said, his tone like stone. "You've had your chance to speak. Now, it's my turn." His gaze softened as he turned back to Amara. Slowly, carefully, he reached out again, this time letting his trembling hand rest on the back of her small, fragile fingers. Her skin was warm, delicate, real. Amara, he whispered, tasting her name for the first time, as if it had been waiting on his tongue all these years. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know. But I see you now. And I will never, never, let you go again. Her tears spilled freely then, but for the first time, they weren't only tears of fear. They carried something else, something she had long buried but never stopped longing for. Hope. Jonathan's own eyes glistened as he fought to steady his voice. You're my daughter. My blood. And I swear on everything I am, no one will hurt you again. The weight of the words hung in the air, undeniable, unshakable. Lydia shrank further into the corner, her lies collapsing around her like ashes. For the first time, she realized she had lost control, not just of the room, but of the very life she had built on secrets. Jonathan no longer looked at her. He no longer needed to. His entire world, his entire purpose, had narrowed to the small girl before him. Amara blinked up at him, her lips trembling as if trying to form words. She wanted to speak, to say what her heart screamed, but her voice faltered. Instead, she did something far more powerful. She let her small hand slip into his. Jonathan's breath hitched. The simple gesture unraveled him. Her fingers, so tiny yet so strong, curled around his trembling hand as if they belonged there. As if they had always belonged there. In that fragile bond, father and daughter were reunited, not by blood alone, but by something deeper. By truth. By love. The storm had finally broken, and in its place, a promise took root. The truth had unfolded, and nothing in Ravenbrook, or beyond, would ever be the same again. The world was still asleep when Jonathan and Amara stepped out of the apartment for the last time. The streets of Ravenbrook were hushed, the air cool and heavy with the scent of salt carried in from the harbor. The sky, still wrapped in night, began to soften, hints of gold and pink bleeding along the horizon. It was as if the city itself was preparing to witness a promise long overdue. Jonathan's hand wrapped firmly around Amara's smaller one. She clung to him, not with fear, but with a quiet, fragile trust. Each step they took together seemed to peel away the shadows that had once held her captive. The further they walked, the more she felt it. She was leaving behind the nights of trembling under harsh words, the days of hunger and silence. Ahead of her, something different waited. Something she had only dared to dream of. When they reached the harbor, the sea greeted them with its endless breath, waves lapping softly against the pier. The wooden boards creaked beneath their feet as Jonathan led her to the edge, where the water stretched out like an eternal promise. Above them, the sky had begun to bloom, streaks of sunlight breaking free, painting the horizon in fiery shades of gold. Amara's eyes widened. She had never seen the morning like this before. Never had the world looked so big, so alive, so free. Jonathan released her hand only to kneel before her, his tall figure bending low so that his eyes could meet hers without barrier. He studied her face, so small, yet so strong, marked by battles no child should ever have fought. His heart clenched, not with regret anymore, but with resolve. Amara, he whispered, his voice breaking against the weight of emotion. From this moment on, everything changes. Her lips trembled, but she said nothing. She only looked at him, her eyes searching his as though she feared he might disappear if she blinked. Jonathan reached for her hands again, enclosing them in his larger ones. I promise you, no one will ever hurt you again. Not with words, not with hands, not with silence. Those days are gone. His voice grew steadier, like an anchor sinking deep into the sea. You are my daughter. My flesh. My heart. And from today forward, you will know only love. Amara's breath hitched, and for the first time in what felt like forever, her tears were not carved from fear. They spilled freely, but they glistened like the morning light. They were tears of belonging, tears that washed away the weight of years. She threw her arms around his neck, her tiny frame trembling against him. Jonathan's arms wrapped around her, strong and protective, as though he could shield her from the whole world. For a long time, they stayed that way, father and daughter, their shadows stretching long across the pier as the sun climbed higher. Behind them, Ravenbrook City stirred awake, the hum of engines, the clang of morning markets, the rhythm of life beginning again. But on that pier, time felt suspended. For Amara, this was not just another morning. This was the first morning she had ever truly felt safe. Jonathan pulled back slightly, brushing her hair gently from her damp cheeks. His voice softened into something she had never known before, gentleness wrapped in strength. "There will be laughter now," he said. "There will be warmth in your days, and peace in your nights. You'll go to school, you'll play, you'll dream. And you'll never have to beg for kindness again." Her small hand clutched his tightly, as if sealing the promise. "You mean it," she whispered, her voice thin, fragile, but carrying the weight of her heart. Jonathan's eyes glistened. He nodded, his voice steady. "With everything I am. I swear it." For the first time, Amara allowed herself to believe it. To believe that this man, this father, wasn't just speaking words, but building a future with them. The sun rose higher, spilling gold across the water. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the quiet. Jonathan stood, lifting Amara into his arms as though she weighed nothing. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, a rhythm strong enough to drown out every cruel word she had ever endured. As they stood at the edge of the pier, the wind rushing against them, Jonathan looked out across the endless horizon. For years, his wealth had filled rooms with luxury, but it had never filled the emptiness inside him. Now, holding this child, his child, he felt richer than he had ever known. The city behind them buzzed with its usual rhythm of ambition and noise, but none of it mattered. For father and daughter, life had shifted. The pain of the past would not vanish overnight, but it would be rewritten, piece by piece, with love as its author. Amara closed her eyes, her tears finally quieting as peace settled over her small body. Jonathan kissed her hair, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if he could already see the life waiting for them. A life where scars healed. Where shadows fled. Where laughter returned. A new dawn, he whispered into the salty breeze. For both of us. The sun crowned the harbor in brilliance, and for the first time in a very long time, Amara smiled. And there, on that quiet pier of Ravenbrook, as the day unfolded, father and daughter stepped into the beginning of forever. Thank you so much for watching this story until the end. Stories like Amara's remind us that even in the darkest moments, love and courage can change everything. If this touched your heart, please don't just click away, share it with someone who needs hope today. And if you'd love to hear more powerful stories like this one, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss when a new story drops. Leave a comment below and tell us, what part of this story moved you the most? We'd love to hear your thoughts.